All right, I hate to cut off such jubilant conversation, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We're in Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 16. Ideally, we'll finish chapter 1, and I'd like to get into chapter 2 today. I know that's probably pretty ambitious, but we do need to keep things moving along in our class, and I guess I should just tell that to myself, because it's not your fault that we get bogged down. Entirely mine. Let's go ahead and start with a quick word of prayer, and we're going to be in Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 16. Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for a wonderful life and a beautiful, beautiful world that surrounds us. We thank you for all the rich, rich blessings and treasures of this world, the physical blessings that surround us, the fruitfulness of this earth and its seasons. We thank you so much for the relative health that we've enjoyed. We thank you so much for our prosperity. But God, all of these things pale in comparison to the glorious treasures that we have in your Son, Jesus Christ. And if we were to lose everything physical in this world, if we were stripped of everything and stripped down to just us before you, and if we only had your Son at our side, standing before us as our advocate, then that's all we need, and that's a blessing enough on its own. God, help us to embrace that and to understand that we have a cross to bear. Help us to not love this world nor the things in this world. We appreciate them. We appreciate our physical blessings, but we know that those things are not heaven, that we are not in heaven. So help us to live out that life, that heavenward, heaven-bound, heaven-directed life. Help us to study the Scriptures with all our mind and all our heart, and to make a ready and quick application of the things that we learn to our own lives today. We pray all of this in your Son's most wonderful name. Amen. All right, so here in Mark chapter 1, we are in the midst of a series of very, very exciting and engaging events in the life of Jesus. Early on in his ministry here in Galilee, he is performing miracle after miracle. The text talks about how people from all over, from all the villages and all the towns, are gathering around Jesus to see him, to embrace him, to learn from him, and to experience that miraculous power as well. So, here we are in Mark chapter 1, and let's start here in verse 16. And we're not going to read every single one of these miracles. We don't have time to look at them in great detail, but we do want to point out a few things. Mark 1, verse 16. Now, as he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I'll make you become fishers of men." And they immediately left the net and followed him. Matthew and Luke also add a lot of context to this. And we also learn from John's Gospel that this event by the sea was not the first time that Jesus ever interacted with these future disciples. Right? In John chapter 1, we learn that Andrew was already a follower of John the Baptist and went and found his brother and said, "We found the Christ! We found the Christ!" So there's already kind of Peter and Andrew have already had some exposure to Jesus. And so when Jesus shows up at the seashore and is teaching, and he gets into Peter's boat and starts to teach from there, we also learn from the other gospel accounts that there was a fairly surprising and impressive thing that preceded this: "You'll become fishers of men." What did Peter and Andrew see? What happened to them before Jesus said, "You're going to become fishers of men"? What happened to them by the sea? Did they catch a few fish? Caught a lot of fish. They caught so many fish it was actually making their boat sink. They caught so many fish, and had they been trying to fish already? Peter said, "We've been fishing all night, but listen, at your command, we're going to cast the nets one more time." All right. They cast the nets. They're pulling out so many fish from the sea, the boats are starting to swamp. And Peter is so overwhelmed by the whole thing that he says, "Get away from me. I'm a sinful man. I can't be around you. I'm too sinful." And that's where Jesus reassures him and says, "Listen, you've been a fisherman. I'm telling you now, you're going to become fishers of men. I've got a new job for you. You're going to redirect your life." So that's the other gospel accounts provide a little bit more of the context here. But Mark gets down to, this is the point. He tells Peter and Andrew, James, John, these are fishermen by trade, "I have a new job for you. Okay, follow me, and I'll make you become fishers of men." Verse 18, they immediately left the nets and followed him. Going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants. I've said before, Mark is more brief, but Mark often throws in like little details that the other gospel accounts don't include. That's another little detail there. None of the other gospel accounts say that they left Zebedee at the boats with the servants. You know, you almost get the impression, right? You almost get the impression that James and John just leave Zebedee in the lurch, and he's like sitting there holding nets, like, boys, what are you doing here? But Mark does include this little detail that I think it's a nice little detail. That it's not like Zebedee was just like abandoned. Like Zebedee was not like, guys, hey, leaving the family business here, leaving your old man mending nets all by himself. No, there were hired servants there as well. So it's not like Zebedee was just there by himself. They didn't abandon their father, is the point that I'm getting. I like that Mark just throws that little note in there with the hired servants that went away to follow him. Any observations before we move on? I know I'm going kind of quick here, but any observations about Peter, Andrew, James, and John? Any lessons that you take away? What do you learn from these this calling to become disciples? Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I don't know if it's intentional, but there is an inference that our response should be immediately.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of talk about, well, before I become a Christian, I think I need to read this many chapters in the Bible or fix this in my life. There's this power of beauty and purpose in responding immediately to the gospel.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I like that. And like I said, John chapter 1 does offer this in John chapter 1 and 39 through 42. Andrew had been a disciple of John the Baptist. He goes and finds his brother Peter, Simon, and tells him that we have found the Christ. Like, we found the Christ. We found the Messiah. And he brings him to Jesus. And that's where Jesus in verse 42 says, well, you're Simon the son of John, but I'm going to call you Cephas, which is the Aramaic Kephos for Peter, Petra for rock, right? So it's not like, see, I like your point, Scott. It's not like just Jesus walked up to Peter one day and didn't know him from Adam and just said, like, you're going to become a fisher of men. And Peter goes, okay. There was some context, but what I like, Scott, about your comment is, as soon as the call comes, does Peter know enough now to make a decision and act on this? Yeah. Now, does Peter understand everything about Jesus? Certainly not. Is Peter probably still pretty confused about, like, maybe what exactly is going to be involved in this fishers of men business? Like, maybe he doesn't understand fully, like, the implications of that, or, like, long term what that's going to involve. Surely he doesn't. In fact, I think the early part of the ministry, you do see Peter, Andrew, James, and John holding on to some pretty strange misconceptions about the kingdom, some pretty heady ideas about what it means to be a disciple in the inner circle of Jesus. Like, they don't know everything. But do they know enough that when Jesus says, I need you to make a decision. Do you want to become a fisher of fish? You want to do that for the rest of your life? You want to throw nets in the sea for the rest of your life? Or do you think there's something, a higher calling for you? There's something out there where you can change people's lives. What do you want? Peter knew enough, Andrew knew enough, James and John knew enough that when it came time to make a decision, they decided. I think there's really something to be said about that. Good comment, Scott. I like that. What else do you learn about this?
It's also striking their level of commitment.
Yeah.
Hey, Jesus, we're going to do that on Monday and Wednesday, but Tuesday, Thursdays, we got to fish. This is what we do for a living.
Yeah.
It's a 100% commitment.
Yeah, it's a 100% commitment. I'm trying, and they own property, they own equipment, right? They own nets, they own boats. I'm trying to remember if it's Matthew or Luke's account of this story that says that Peter or Jesus got into Peter's boat. One of the accounts actually points out that he got into Peter's boat. Luke 5 verse 3, it says, and so Jesus got into one of the boats, which was Simon's. Okay, in Luke 5 verse 3. So these are people who have they have investment in this business. They were not day laborer fishermen. Okay, they weren't just kind of like well, then maybe we'll go fishing and see what we get, or I'm going to show up, and if anyone needs my help fishing today, I'm going to be like a day laborer. You know, Simon and Peter, James and John, like, this was a family business. This is a multi-generational family business where they've invested in. They've got equipment, they've got property, they've got. Zebedee's got hired servants. He's got staff. And so the fact that they're willing to divest themselves of something like that and say, all right, what are we going to be now? Itinerant preachers living in tents? Okay, I guess that's my life now. Not a lot of money in being an itinerant preacher in Galilee. Not a lot of money there. Not a lot of safety there. Health insurance, not great. Okay? But Robin, that's a good point. It's a level of commitment that says, all right, I've divested myself of this, and I'm going to commit myself to something different. So really high level of spiritual and emotional and also physical investment. Yeah, good comment. Really good comment. Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
We know, this tells us a little bit, Peter's married, so he's,
Yeah.
that's totally fine too.
Yeah, exactly. I do appreciate. I don't want to lean too heavily on the show The Chosen, although I do recommend it. I think it's great. It's a great show with only hesitation being tons of artistic license taken. But I think artistic license that's within the realm of respectful to the biblical text. But I do like how The Chosen handled that whole thing with Peter and his wife and him. And she was very supportive. In the show, she's very supportive of, like, this guy is the Messiah. And when the Messiah says, go become a disciple, Peter, you go. And she was completely supportive of Peter leaving and following Jesus in his Galilean ministry. So I thought that was a neat part of the Chosen. I appreciated the way that was handled. But you're right. He's also going to leave behind a wife. Not abandoning her, to be certain. There's family members to take care of her. But I think it's a good point to bring out also. I like that, Rebecca. Okay, so let's go on to verse 21. So they went to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered. This word immediately again. Immediately. It's just over and over and over again in the Gospel of Mark. This is a book of action and events. And immediately, on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began to teach. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. I want to unpack that a little bit. I like verse 22. Let's unpack that. What is the difference between one having authority, like Jesus, and the scribes? Because that's the contrast being drawn. He taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. What's the difference between those two things? Why could they tell that Jesus was different? Clay?
The scribes really kind of wrote what they were told and didn't really have any critical knowledge of their own, per se. They're just kind of writing what they were told to write.
That's a good point. So, yeah, if we're talking about scribes in terms of these are experts in the law, so they know the law, they know the scriptures, their primary job is copying and disseminating and teaching the law. It's not necessarily their job to come in as the authority. Now, did they sometimes act like they were the authority? Did the scribes and Pharisees often act like they were high and mighty and knew more than everybody else and could tell everybody else what to do? Sure, they did. I think it's interesting how people can tell the difference between Jesus and the scribes. The scribes thought they had a lot of authority and acted like it. Jesus actually had authority and spoke in a very different way. To me, it's like the difference between, and I don't want to just, I know Joel Osteen's easy to pick on. I really don't mean to pick on Joel Osteen as a human being, as a person who has a soul and is loved and valued by God, as any soul would be. And yet, Joel Osteen offers himself up to criticism because of the platform that he chooses to have, and because of the awful sermons that he chooses to preach. So, with that being said, is there a difference between a Joel Osteen who just speaks from his own life, his own experiences, his own wisdom, his own book, right? And if you just go to joelosteen.com and just get yourself a fresh copy of my latest book, is there a difference between that and someone who deeply and consistently relies upon Scripture? Okay, there's a difference between that, and that should taste different. That should have a different spiritual flavor to it. And I think if someone can't tell the difference between Joel Osteen and something that has a lot more depth and substance to it, I don't know what else to say to differentiate between those two things.
Hey, Ryan.
Yeah,
so we see that a lot. Like if somebody writes a book about a famous person and they get interviewed about their book, they're in effect talking about somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's different than if you interview the actual famous person and they're talking about their life.
And that's a good point. I could even take that analogy kind of a step further. There is a difference between the person being interviewed as an authority and the interviewer who is writing about the authority, right? You know, you may say, I had an amazing opportunity to sit down and do an interview with Bill Belichick on football. I want to talk to Bill Belichick, right? He is the authority. Now, you as the interviewer and the presenter, you are not the authority. So there's a big difference between that as well. I think also the fact that there's like abundant miracles taking place, that's probably also a clue. Like there's something different about Jesus than the scribes and Pharisees, because he's healing people who are paralyzed and he's making leprosy go away. I think that requires a little more critical thinking. And just then in verse 23, speaking of which, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, verse 24, saying, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet, and come out of him." Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed in verse 27, so that they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately the news about him went out everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. So do the unclean spirits recognize who Jesus is? What does James chapter 2 say about that? James chapter 2 says the demons believe. They sure do believe. They believe and they tremble. They know exactly who Jesus is. As a side note, I don't want to turn this into a whole lesson on its own, but as a side note, I think it's interesting when you compare. People ask, demon possession is one of those like hot topics, those preacher questions. Preachers always, there's like a few questions that people always want to ask about. And it's things like, the end of the world, and what is heaven going to be like? And one of the really common questions, what about demon possession? Ryan, can you tell me something about demon possession? And I will say, when you look at demon possession as it's explained in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and to a lesser extent the book of Acts, and to an even lesser extent the Old Testament, it is really interesting to see that demon possession in the New Testament is never like demon possession in pop culture. All right, what you see of demon possession in horror movies is nothing like demon possession that you see in the scriptures. In horror movies, demons they're blasphemous and disrespectful and disobedient, and they're rebellious, and they push back against everything. It takes this incredible, the power of Christ compels you and everything. And yet, in the scriptures, when the demons are confronted by the power of Christ, they go like this. They tremble and they beg Jesus. Anything but that, Jesus. They beg Jesus. Can you compromise? Can we go into these pigs over here? Can you not send us into the outer darkness and the abyss? And they're like, I know who you are. I recognize you. You're the Son of God. You're the most holy one of God. Like they cower before God. They're not blasphemous. Now, they are disobedient spirits. Whatever they are, whatever their history and background is, I don't know. And the scriptures don't really explain it. But I do think it's just really fascinating how, what our pop culture vision of demon possession is like is nothing like what we see in the scriptures. And also in terms of, does demon possession happen today? I think there's something you can track. When you look at every example of demon possession or evil spirits, whatever terminology in the scriptures, there is clearly, you go through the Old Testament and there's, almost nothing except for a blip here and there. And then you get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it's that. And then the book of Acts goes like this. And then there's not much else. And so I always find it really interesting. I don't believe that demon possession is presented in the scriptures as a universal for all time phenomenon. I think it's a very specific and unique phenomenon for a very specific period of time. And essentially what's happening is it's a tit for tat kind of matching of God's power. When Satan knows that Jesus, the Son of God, is going to come into this world, he's like, all right, God, if you're going to send your best, I'm going to send my best then. And it's like an arms race kind of thing where, you know, if I'm going to build a nuclear weapon, you're going to make a nuclear weapon. If I'm going to have 100 of them, you're going to have 200 of them. If I'm going to do this, then you're going to do that. And I think that as soon as Jesus entered the world, like an apex predator impacting an environment around him, the spiritual landscape was altered simply because Jesus showed up. This apex predator suddenly entered the landscape, and all of this demon possession happens in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there's a couple examples in Acts, but by the end of the book of Acts, there's nothing. And demons themselves are almost never mentioned in the epistles of the New Testament. Almost as if Jesus came and dealt with it. Anyway, that's just a little bit of my thought on demon possession, if that was something you were curious about. I don't want to do a whole sermon about it right now in our class, but I think that's sufficient at least to answer that. Okay, in terms of what he does, any final lessons you want to take away from verse 28 about this demon-possessed man and how Jesus casts out these demons? Anything else you want to bring out?
Still, Sabbath, I think that's an important note.
Yeah, did it on the Sabbath day. Boy, it's almost like Jesus goes out of his way to do some things on the Sabbath, doesn't he? It's like, oh, you guys were hungry today? Well, look, there's some grain on the side of the road. Why don't you go grab some grain and mash it up in your hands and let's see if anybody notices. It's almost like Jesus goes out of his way. And I would say even with certainty, it is that Jesus goes out of his way on the Sabbath day to challenge their preconceptions. Now, is it that he is actually violating the Sabbath? Or is it more that he is challenging what their preconceptions of the Sabbath were? And maybe their traditions that they elevated as if their traditions were the will of God. Okay, verse 29, and immediately after they had come out of the synagogue, they came to the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever. Immediately they spoke to him about her, and he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on them. Again, Matthew and Luke elaborate a little bit more on some of the details there. I do love it that this is a very faith-confirming thing for Peter, very, very faith-confirming in the sense of the ministry of Jesus wasn't just something that was going to be, kind of impersonal. It wasn't just like, we're not just going to help complete strangers. It's, Peter, Simon, I'm here for you too. I'm here for you also. When you need me, I'm going to be here for you as well. And it was very personal. The fact that Jesus touched the life of Peter personally, I think says a lot. All right, let's go to verse 32 then. And when evening had come after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed. The whole city gathered at the door. He healed many who were ill with various diseases, cast out many demons, and he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. Why doesn't he want the demons to speak? Because if they're speaking the truth about him, you are the Holy One of God. That's the truth, isn't it? Well, if the demons are speaking the truth about Jesus, why doesn't Jesus want them to speak about him? Speculate about that.
It's just not time for him yet.
Yeah, so there's a timing issue with Jesus. It's just not time yet. I don't want that piece of information being revealed yet. Jesus wants to be in control of the flow of information about him. So that's a big part of it. I like that, Eric. That's a big part of it. What else?
Went along the line that it may be that he just didn't want them to be the experts on giving the message.
Yeah. That's kind of, like, I want to control the flow of information, but I also want to control who's saying it. It's kind of like if you were wanting to get your book endorsed, you don't want some like crackpot endorsing your book. You don't want it going out like becoming, on social media and finding out if Ryan Goodman wrote a book, I don't need Joel Osteen being on the back of it, okay? I highly recommend Ryan Goodwin's literature. It's as deep as I am. And so I think there is something to be said about, here's Jesus. Jesus is trying to teach people who he is. He is the Son of God. He is the Christ. He is the Holy One of God. He does not need the endorsement of demons who throw people into convulsions, toss them into fireplaces to burn them, and make them run around naked swearing. Okay? I don't need that as an endorsement. Essentially, Jesus is saying, I am not affiliated with them. I do not know them. So I think that, both of those, that's how I would answer that. I think those are both really satisfactory ways of looking at that. Okay, so abundant. People are coming out. People are coming out. People are coming out. And yet, does Jesus need time for himself? Yeah, I like that the text comes out and says in verse 35, and in the early morning, while it was still dark, he arose and went out and departed to a lonely place and was praying there. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And so the disciples say, well, everybody's looking for you. Now, I find it interesting. I think paradox is not quite the right word. I don't think paradox is what we're looking for there. But there's a complexity to Jesus Christ. There's a complexity to Jesus Christ. That on the one hand, is Christ the Son of God? Yes. Is he the co-creator of the universe? Yes. Colossians chapter 1. Is he the co-creator of mankind? Yes. Let us create man in our image. Is he omnipotent, all-powerful? Yes. But then as Jesus of Nazareth, the human being, does he have limited physical energy? Sure seems like it. Did Jesus require sleep? Yes. Did Jesus require food? Did Jesus require lonely time? Yes, he did. So it's just kind of interesting how Colossians, and it just boils down to me, Colossians 2 verses 9 and 10. Like just what it boils down to it is in Colossians chapter 2, for in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. Everything it means to be God, he's still God, but he's God in a human body. And the God part of him, and I'm not a Docetist, by the way, so I don't believe that there's some separation between the God part and the human part. I'm just speaking in kind of accommodative language. The God part of him is always God. He's always God. He's God on the cross. He's God sleeping. He's God eating food. He's God bleeding. He's God dying. But the human part, right, the physical body, is a physical body. It is a physical body made up of cells with blood that needs to be regenerated, that needs to eat, that needs rest. So it's just, Jesus Christ is such a complicated, nuanced, amazing being. He's incomparable. He's incomparable. I think it's fascinating here that while Jesus is out here, just there is power streaming from him, changing people's lives. Whenever he can catch a moment to go to a dark, quiet, lonely place and just sit and be quiet and meditate and pray and recharge, he's looking for those opportunities. Eric?
Just something that popped in my head now. I just seeing that scene that, he's getting up early and going and praying.
Mm-hmm.
He's God and man.
Yeah.
Here's part of him. God has been with his Father forever. And forever means there's no beginning.
Yeah.
Now he's man. Did he pray like us? He can't hear his Father.
Yeah.
He's praying with no reply, technically, like we don't know.
Yeah, as we would
but
pray.
Does he as God get to talk to his Father? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Did he get out there where he can have a conversation, or is it he's man? He cannot hear his Father. Here he is, 33 years without his Father.
Yeah.
So I've got to pray. And it just popped in my head. How does that work? And it's got to be that he's man.
Yeah.
And he got to pray like we are, because he then goes back and he's our intercessor. So
Yeah.
it's that just popped in my head, and I thought, man, that's another sacrifice that he gave.
That's a good comment. I like that. There is a sacrifice that's made there, just in terms of you've been at the right hand of the Father from eternity past, and you can swirl galaxies into existence with your fingertip. You can speak light into existence, and yet now here you are for 33 years, dragging your feet through the dust, eating food, and getting tired, and these novel experiences, I cannot imagine what it must have been like. I think it's incomparable. We cannot imagine what the experience must have been like to defer and to humble yourself to that extent. For he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself. He emptied himself, coming in the form of a man, even a bondservant. He humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. I just don't know. I just don't know what that was like. Yeah. And I appreciate these moments of quiet that Jesus seeks out. In a book that's filled with action where everything is immediately, even in Mark, the writer points out Jesus needed those quiet times. But everybody's looking for you. And of course, Jesus being Jesus, he loves people. He gets out of his quiet place. He gets out of his lonely place. And he comes back out. Let us go. And he says in verse 38, let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby in order that I may preach there also. For that is what I came out for. And he goes all around Galilee in verse 39, preaching, casting out demons. Now, in verses 40 through 45, then we encounter a leper, all right? A leopard. My kids always say leopard. Why is he healing leopards? A leper, a leprous individual, beseeching him in verse 40 and falling on his knees before him and saying to him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. All right, unpack that. What is astonishing about that statement? Please tell me some things about this man and what he says that is just absolutely astounding.
There was no cure for leprosy.
So there's no cure for leprosy. So he is blatantly saying you can do the impossible. Like that. I mean, that's what he's saying, isn't it? It is impossible to be cured of leprosy, and I believe that you can do the impossible. So that's a great point. Jeff, were you going to say something? I thought maybe you were going to take. Yeah, and he believed also. He believed, and it wasn't like a blind, stupid belief. Okay, it wasn't just him like blindly accepting something, and it also wasn't a belief of just like saying, "Well, I've tried everything else. I guess I can try Jesus." It wasn't a last option when I have nothing else I can do kind of belief. It is I'm fully invested. I'm in on this. The only thing that's stopping me from being healed is simply your willingness. You are able to do this, and I know that I can be healed if you are willing. And it's just astounding. It's astounding.
The Matthew account of this, Jesus touches him, which would have been shocking to people because leprosy is so contagious.
Yeah.
So that would have been
yeah. And the fact that there was a cleanliness issue there, at least ceremonial cleanliness, and that the thing he tells the leper to do after he's healed is go and meet with the priest and offer the sacrifice. I just think it's so cool that here's Jesus touching a man who probably, and I don't think it's a stretch, I don't think it's just beyond the imagination, this is a man who probably hasn't been touched physically in decades? I don't know. I don't know how long he's been a leper. For most of his life? I don't know. We take touch for granted. I'll say this. I want to be careful because in our culture today, we do live in a very litigious culture. We have a culture where there's suitable boundaries that need to be in place. And so I've always wanted to do a sermon about human touch and what the power of human touch is. But I'll just say, like, just being honest, I've never felt like the occasion has presented itself where I felt comfortable, like that lesson in our litigious society would not be misconstrued somehow. But I'll just say this. I think we take for granted the value of touch. And there is an appropriate way and an inappropriate way. There is a right time and a wrong time, a right context and an absolutely wrong context for human contact. But just think about the number of times that you've been comforted and reassured just by someone touching you. The difference between when you've been welcomed somewhere by a handshake versus welcomed somewhere without a handshake. The times where you've gone to the funeral and you just really, really, really needed to sob on someone's shoulder, and someone loved you enough to just let you put mascara all over their suit jacket. Okay, and as a preacher who's done a lot of funerals and has worn a lot of suit jackets and crisp, light-colored shirts, it's okay. You can put mascara on my shoulder. I'm fine with that. That's okay. I just think we forget how valuable human touch is until you've been a leper for most of your life, and no one will touch you. Not a handshake, not a hug, not someone sitting close to you.
I think that's too why I ask, are you willing?
Yeah, are you even, no one's willing to do this for me.
Anybody that's willing, but tries to be your help.
Yeah.
Are you willing?
Yeah. I just think that this is a really, really special and unique moment that we see from Jesus. I think it's very powerful. And if someone, one of my, the 5 love languages, one of my love languages is not with anybody else, but with Rebecca, is physical touch. I'm kind of, as a preacher, I'm not a touchy-feely person as a preacher, because I think it's very important to maintain a professional, separation as far as physically goes with people. But I value Rebecca. I just really value physical touch a lot. And so I can appreciate this little moment here where he stretched out his hand in verse 41, moved with compassion. I love that Mark points that out. He's moved with compassion. And it's because, listen, could he have healed him without touching him? Yeah, absolutely. So touching him was a choice.
He even touched me before he said, I'm willing.
Yeah. Touching him was a conscious choice. It's a conscious choice. Moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand and he touched him. And then said, like you pointed out, I think it's a good comment, and then said, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. And he sternly warned him in verse 43 and immediately sent him away and said in verse 44, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a testimony to them. That's kind of an interesting response. So he heals them, and it's this incredible emotional, physical moment that he has with this individual, and then sternly warns him, don't go tell anybody. Your life has been changed forever. Don't go tell anyone.
And there's probably hundreds of people standing around there right there that saw it.
There's witnesses. Yeah, witnesses. The leper was probably part of a leper colony, right? There were probably other lepers that he had been around. When you don't have anyone else in your life willing to come to you, you just gravitate toward other people with leprosy. So he's suddenly not part of the leper colony. He's, noticeably not there anymore. Family, friends, maybe people who knew him before his leprosy. Like, the word's going to get out. One way that I answer this, I think, one explanation would be, maybe what Jesus is saying is, he's not saying, never tell anybody that this happened to you. But he's saying, there's an order of things that need to happen. And you need to go talk to the priest first. And there are laws in the Old Testament about, when you've had a skin condition of some kind, lesions, boils, whatever, even leprosy, the laws in the Old Testament were, when that is cleaned off, when you're healed or when it does heal on its own, whatever it happened to be, you are supposed to go to the priest, show yourself to the priest so that he can essentially check off, right? Check off and say, yes, he is cleansed, he's ceremonially clean, ritually clean, he's allowed to come back to the tabernacle, he's allowed to come back into the camp. And so Jesus is saying there's an order to things. So I speculate that it is less about, this is a secret you've got to keep for your whole life. I think that's not quite the meaning of it is, you're never allowed to tell anybody ever. And more about, I need you to do this in the right order. You need to go to the priest. You need to show yourself to the priest. You need to offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a testimony. And then, listen, you're going to go on with the rest of your life and people are going to notice that you're cleansed. Does the man do that, though? I know. Listen, I sympathize with him, okay, because I also am an enthusiastic person who tends to stick his foot in his mouth. So let's put the cart before the horse a little bit. That's my personality. That's how I am. I tend to get pretty excited about things. I'm the kind of guy that when I buy a Christmas present for someone, I just want to tell them, I got something for you today. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I ordered it from here, and it's red, and it's your right size. Like, that's kind of how I am. I get very excited. So I guess I don't come at this from a very judgy perspective, but unfortunately, what is the result in everybody just look at verse 45 real quick. Just read that real quick. Unfortunately, what is the result of this formerly leprous man's eagerness? He put the cart before the horse. He did not do what Jesus told him to do. And what is the side effect from that? He's mobbed now. Yeah. He can't go anywhere. He's mobbed. He can't go anywhere. And it actually makes it harder for him to proceed with his ministry. And that was probably the reason all along was, I'm going to heal you because I love you and I have compassion. I want to change your life. And I want you to be a witness. I want you to go out and witness and tell people about me and promote the name of the Son of God and let the cleansing happen. But I need this to happen in a certain order because I'm trying to control this. Again, it's a flow of information. It's an orderly ministry. And now because of this, it's chaotic. It's a mess. He can't go anywhere anymore. And now he's got to go do his ministry in unpopulated areas just because it's just too hard for him to move among crowds anymore. So unfortunately, the man's enthusiasm caused a bit of a trouble for Jesus in practical terms. So that's kind of the unfortunate part of it. Any other thoughts then on that episode? Go ahead, Rebecca.
Jesus' priority is for him to go reestablish contact with God. Really, I mean, that's like go and reestablish your fellowship and your ability to worship because you've been separated from that for however long.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, what Rebecca said was Jesus' priority is first and foremost you've got to go reestablish your relationship with God in terms of your ritual cleanliness and your ability to go offer sacrifices and commune at the temple and go to synagogue. First and foremost, you need to go reestablish that practical, covenantal, ritual relationship with God. And the man, again, puts the cart before the horse and gets ahead of himself there, and it causes some chaos. All right, when we get together, Mark chapter 2, beginning verse 12, we're going to look at the miracle of the man whose friends lower him through the roof. Really, really great story. That's what we're going to be looking at when we get together on Wednesday night. It's good to see you again today, by the way. Remind me of your name. Leah? Mike. Okay, my brother's name is Mike, so I need to be able to remember. And I've got a cousin named Leah, so I should be able to remember that. Mike and Leah. And you prefer Mike, not Michael. Okay, is your name Michael, like original? Sound the same way. My brother's Mike. But I grew up calling him Mike. I'm like, even my mom called him Mike. I'm the only person left who got your name. You knew? Yeah. Well, it's good to see you again, Mike. Yeah. Leah abandoned you, by the way. Yeah. All the way, yeah. That's a good subtitle. The crowds have dispersed. You can read about Galilee again. Is that Lida?
I don't know if we're going to go because it's the dog. I had to take that day. He's outside right now, but we're not in the house to trade you 3 minutes. So he's been doing okay. He's just been a little bit. He's had a couple of accidents. So he doesn't like the